In the quiet shadows of a medieval village, long before moonlit serenades or love letters sealed with wax, marriage had very little to do with love. The air is still. A thatched roof crackles slightly in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowly moans in the dark. A peasant girl, no older than 12, sits on a wooden stool by the hearth, twisting a thread between her fingers. Marriage was primarily about property, alliances, and survival. Would your children be strong enough to help with the harvest? These were the questions that mattered. A local lord might even have to approve your union, especially if you lived on his land. Romantic attraction played little to no role in the matter. Whether you were a peasant in the field or a noble behind stone walls, your romantic desires were usually irrelevant. Officially, a marriage needed to be consensual. But what did that mean for a girl pressured by her family, or a boy under the eye of his feudal lord? Girls as young as 12 could legally wed. Boys at 14, a trap sometimes. Once you were bound, escape was nearly impossible. Divorce wasn't allowed. Annulments were rare and reserved for the powerful. The ceremony might be simple. A vow exchanged at the church door, witnessed by a handful of neighbors, and sealed with a kiss and a blessing. Consent was more theoretical than real. Your bride might be 10 years younger, or you might be promised to someone you'd never met. The concept of childhood as we understand it today didn't truly exist. A girl of 7 might be considered old enough to be engaged. A boy of 14, a man. But actual marriage might still be years away. And once a betrothal was formalized, breaking it could be seen as dishonorable or dangerous. Some treaties between kingdoms even hinged on such matters. These arrangements were about sealing alliances, securing land, and planning lineage. It was like moving pieces on a board, except the pieces were people. A father might promise his daughter to a neighbor's son to strengthen ties between farms. A bride's youth wasn't seen as a concern. As long as she could work and bear children, that was enough. That wasn't the point, that you'd be expected to bear children before your body was fully grown. For noble girls especially, their body became a resource for dynasties, a vessel for heirs, and an object to be given away. A teenage bride, navigating a strange household, married to a man old enough to be her father. A boy told to marry a girl he barely knew, expected to start a family before he understood the weight of adulthood. A mother sits by the fire, hands folded in her lap, eyes distant. She is not thinking of love or weddings, but of money. A daughter's family was expected to provide this gift, a collection of money, goods, or land, as a kind of incentive or compensation for taking their girl into another household. It could include livestock, cooking pots, woolens, or even a spinning wheel. The dowry said, "We are not sending her empty-handed," and it had to be respectable. Her daughter has just turned 13, and the clock is quietly ticking. Marriage must be arranged, if they can afford it. Some pawned tools or sold livestock. Others bargained down the dowry by pairing their daughter with a widower or someone from a lower social rung. His daughter, barely out of infancy, lies asleep upstairs beneath layers of wool and linen. A daughter's marriage could be the difference between survival and ruin. A girl might be forced to marry a distant cousin, a dull tradesman, or a gruff farmer, not because he inspired affection, but because he required no dowry at all. But until then, she lived not just under his roof, but under his power. Inside, a folded woolen cloak, a battered silver spoon, a string of blue beads. Not much, but perhaps enough. She closes the lid, sighs, and prays that it will be accepted. One that could ruin a family's finances or elevate their status overnight. A village ceremony might be quick and simple. A blessing at the church door, a shared drink, and perhaps a small feast, if the family could manage it. She could not own land, sign contracts, or manage money without his approval. But even a humble feast required flour, ale, meat, all precious commodities. The mechanics of matchmaking weren't driven by romance, but by negotiation, property, and leverage. But for peasants and craftsmen, even a modest dowry was a burden. Some girls never married because their families simply couldn't afford it. Others were married off quickly, perhaps to older or less desirable men, simply to reduce the strain on household expenses. She has just been promised to a man 3 times her age, one she will not meet for years. The groom often had to offer a bride price, a sum or service given to the bride's family as a kind of purchase or show of commitment. In some regions, this included years of labor, especially if the groom was a servant or serf. Marriage wasn't free. It was a burden measured in goads, acres, or coin. Your birth decided your fate, and once the ink dried on your betrothal, it was nearly impossible to escape it. Your hands tremble, not from excitement, but from the weight of what's expected. They have no idea what's ahead, only that this is what must be done. The sun is just rising. Two children stand awkwardly side by side, surrounded by solemn faces. A priest murmurs the Latin rites. A document is signed. A future is sealed. Your life has just been tied, irrevocably, to another's, and it may never be yours again. Betrothals could happen before a child could even speak in full sentences. But these small, private longings rarely shaped reality. A single match could unite two rival clans, end a feud, or strengthen a bloodline. These decisions were calculated, strategic. The child's feelings, if they were even consulted, didn't matter. A father might arrange the engagement the same way he arranged a dowry or livestock exchange. Practical, emotionless. For these families, marrying for love was seen as reckless, even dangerous. It upset the delicate balance of dynasties. Parents, lords, and even kings made the decisions for you. And the decision was rarely gentle. Her future has already been decided. You see, in medieval Europe, love as the foundation of marriage was almost unthinkable. If you were a peasant, marriage was an economic arrangement. Could your partner work the land? Did their family own livestock? Among the nobility, things were colder still. Marriages were strategic tools for power and inheritance. Still, in secret, people dreamed. In the flickering firelight, someone might glance across the village square or the great hall. Maybe a hand brushed another during the feast. Maybe hearts beat faster. Sometimes, the church tried to weigh in. The church also preached that marriage was sacred, a holy sacrament, but they didn't enforce age restrictions until much later. But for all the religious pageantry, the practical truth remained. Marriage was about utility. It was a contract, a tool. So when you close your eyes tonight, imagine what it was like to stand on that cold church step. Not in a gown of white lace, but a rough spun tunic, feet cold on stone. Welcome to medieval love. The wind curls softly through the heavy wooden shutters of a stone manor. Inside, a nobleman signs a parchment by candlelight. In medieval times, betrothals often happened in early childhood. For noble families, early betrothals were political tools. The church technically required that both parties consent when they came of age, but in practice, few dared resist their family's wishes. Imagine being 10 years old, learning your future husband was a man you'd never met, that he was already among peasants. Things were less formal but still rooted in family pressure. And while these age gaps were accepted, even encouraged, it doesn't take much to imagine how isolating it must have felt. Not every marriage turned cold. Some couples grew fond of one another over time. Companionship was possible, even affection, but love was never guaranteed. In some ways, marriage was a kind of social sentence, a structure imposed from above, dictated by status and bloodlines. Now, picture a quiet rural chapel, tucked beneath a hill. The girl fidgets, unsure what to feel. The boy glances at her, and then away. And so, with barely a whisper of protest, another medieval marriage begins. In the hush of a small medieval village, a cottage hearth flickers softly. The air smells faintly of peat smoke and stew. In medieval society, marriage wasn't just a union of two people. It was a costly transaction. At the center of it all was the dowry. For wealthier families, dowries could be lavish. Land grants, jewelry, entire manors. And it wasn't just the bride's family that paid. Weddings themselves were not the grand romantic affairs we imagine today. Many families went into debt to afford their daughter's wedding. And so, love became entangled with economics. Some families tried to save for years, putting aside coin or weaving wool for market just to have something respectable to offer. And when a woman married, all her possessions, including her dowry, typically became her husband's property. She lost her legal identity. If her husband died, she might regain some rights as a widow. In some sad cases, a bride might be returned like damaged goods if the marriage proved unsatisfactory, often with scandal, shame, or violence attached. Now, picture that same flickering hearth. The mother gently pulls a chest from under the bed, because in medieval times, a woman's future wasn't measured by love or laughter, but by what she could bring in a box. Imagine a candlelit hall. Banners hang from high rafters. Harp music drifts like smoke through the air. A lady in a long silk gown drops her handkerchief on the rush-strewn floor. A knight in shining armor kneels gallantly to retrieve it, his eyes full of longing, his heart brimming with noble passion. It was ritualized flirting, a staged performance of desire, often between people who were already married to others. Poets called troubadours, and composed songs and poems about unattainable love, usually directed toward a noblewoman above their station. These works were emotional, flowery, and deliberately exaggerated. He might compose verses praising her eyebrows. He might perform feats of strength in a tournament, all while thinking of her scarf tied around his arm. The lady in question was often a pawn, desired not for herself, but for what she symbolized: refinement, virtue, and noble prestige. It was a game played among the nobility, with its own rules, boundaries, and strange expectations. Their lives were shaped by toil, childbirth, and survival. No one wrote poetry about that. It allowed them to pretend. He pledges to fight a duel in her name. She rewards him with a glance and the faintest smile. Wives to husbands, knights to lords, women to fathers, then to grooms. Real feelings were dangerous, even forbidden, but longing was acceptable. It was about not falling in love, and keeping up appearances instead, so long as it stayed just out of reach. This is courtly love. He was supposed to pine, to yearn, to endure rejection and humiliation. The woman, noble, graceful, usually married, might smile kindly or offer a token, but consummation was rarely the point, performed in castles. For a man of the church to fall in love, even just emotionally, was sin. For a peasant girl to get caught with a man before marriage could mean ostracization, whipping, or worse. When she fell in love with a tutor, the famed philosopher Abelard, they were discovered. If a woman became pregnant before marriage, her options were few. If she gave birth out of wedlock, the child might be declared illegitimate, barred from inheritance, and often labeled as cursed. The mother might be condemned in church, or made to do public penance in rags, with ashes on her head. Her uncle had him castrated, and say was forced into a convent. Their passionate letters survived, but their lives were torn apart, secretly, desperately, furtively. They met by moonlight, whispered vows. A village midwife might help a young woman hide a pregnancy. Even priests, on occasion, were known to marry lovers in secret, bending the rules for mercy's sake. It was dangerous, disobedient, a crack in the foundation of family and faith, left symbols carved into trees or scratched into wooden beams. Lover, it seemed, was an impulse even medieval life couldn't fully tame, whispered behind fans. In some areas of Europe, lovers who eloped without family consent were banished. Confessors were trained to root out sins of the flesh. Parish priests preached against lust and immoderate kissing. Some towns even issued ordinances against holding hands in public without betrothal. If the couple belonged to rival families, the fallout could mean blood feuds, land seizures, or even execution for dishonor. The goal was devotion from afar, not fulfillment. But here is the truth. Courtly love was never meant to result in marriage, or even a real relationship. Courtly love developed in the 12th and 13th centuries, especially in French and Occitan courts. A stolen kiss behind the stables. According to the rules of courtly love, the man had to suffer. In a society where marriages were arranged to consolidate land, forge alliances, or maintain family honor, falling in love with the wrong person could bring ruin. Real marriages were arranged for land, title, and wealth. Real husbands were often decades older, and real love, if it happened at all, came after years of shared hardship. A typical courtly lover vowed loyalty to his lady the way a vassal swore loyalty to his lord. And yet, behind all this high-minded sentiment was a world deeply structured by power, patriarchy, and control. This romantic ideal where the knight loves the lady more purely than life itself had almost no connection to actual marriage. For peasant women, courtly love was a distant fantasy, something they might hear about in stories or songs, but never experience. But the upper classes, bored, restless, and hemmed in by politics, found escape in this emotional theater. Courtly love gave them an outlet, and perhaps that's what makes it so haunting, because beneath the perfume and poetry, everyone still belonged to someone else. So next time you picture a knight and a lady exchanging secret glances in a rose garden, remember, it wasn't about falling in love. A strange, quiet dance, and almost always left unfinished. The flicker of a candle in a dark stone chamber, a letter slipped beneath a door, a brief glance in a crowded chapel. These were the kinds of small, dangerous choices that could change lives, or end them, in medieval times. Romantic love, especially the kind that defied social rules, was not just frowned upon, it was often illegal, immoral, or even heretical. For a noblewoman to entertain a suitor without permission was scandalous. Punishments were not consistent, but they were harsh. A particularly tragic tale comes from 14th century France. A young noblewoman, say, was placed under the guardianship of her uncle. Even among the peasantry, romance outside the approved channels could be risky. The church, ever watchful, saw uncontrolled desire as a threat to order. Yet, despite these harsh systems, people still loved, and sometimes communities quietly looked the other way. A miller might arrange for a couple to be surprised in bed, forcing a hasty wedding. But mercy was rare, and consequences were often swift. In the cold eyes of the law, love that slipped outside the boundaries was not noble or romantic. So the lovers ran, hid, lied, or endured the shame. Their stories, often forgotten, lie hidden in parish records, forgotten letters, and whispered folk tales, fleeting but real, tender but tragic. They remind us that, for all the rituals and structures of medieval society, human longing persisted, raw, aching, and sometimes punished simply for being real. Close your eyes, and imagine the open countryside of medieval England, or the misty highlands of Scotland. A dirt path winds between fields and forests. A young woman walks home from the well. She hears hoofbeats behind her. Moments later, she's lifted from the ground, bundled onto a horse, and taken, but by a man who wishes to make her his wife. Bride abduction, or marriage by capture, was a grim reality in many parts of medieval Europe, especially in rural regions, or among warring clans. And often, it wasn't condemned, it was tolerated, even expected. In Ireland and parts of Eastern Europe, rival clans would kidnap daughters of enemy lords to secure alliances or weaken their enemy's honor. These women became bargaining chips, their lives altered in a single ride through the trees. If it could be argued that the couple had engaged in intimacy, whether or not it was consensual, it could be ruled that the marriage should stand. In Scotland, entire battles were sparked over stolen brides. This concept, chilling as it is, was called proverba de prisonnier, a spoken consent that, once uttered or presumed, made the union binding. But even in later centuries, echoes of these abductions remained. In songs, ballads, but in medieval times, love was often tangled in power, fear, and ownership. Sometimes, the only vow spoken was the sound of galloping hooves, disappearing into the fog, and the cautious silence of women who remembered how easily love could be taken, not given. This wasn't just the stuff of legend or romanticized ballads. It was seen as proof of honor, of chastity, of obedience. Modern science tells us that not every virgin will, and many physical factors can influence this. But in medieval minds, absence of blood meant dishonor. If the sheets came back clean, accusations could follow, of unchastity, infidelity, or fraud. A queen or duchess accused of being impure could see her marriage annulled, her children declared illegitimate, or her land seized. Even the whisper of suspicion could unravel dynasties. And for families looking to secure alliances or increase dowries, a daughter's virginity was treated like a legal guarantee. Midwives might be called to examine a bride before the wedding, checking the hymen or assessing her body for signs of previous sexual activity. With deeply flawed and unscientific methods, these inspections were humiliating and deeply traumatic, though accepted as custom in certain places and periods. A man who feared rejection or lacked the bride price might take matters into his own hands. Some used tricks, like hiding a cut finger under the sheets to create the illusion of proof. Others bribed witnesses or relied on midwives sympathetic to their plight. Stories of such acts circulate in folk tales and urban legends of the time, hinting at quiet acts of rebellion in the face of oppressive norms. Outside the room, family members murmur and wait, some anxiously, others impatiently. A bride might be sent away in disgrace, her dowry forfeited. In some extreme cases, women were executed for perceived dishonor, especially in societies with strict honor codes, or where religious fervor ran high. In the morning, they will look for evidence, not of love, but of legitimacy. One of the most widely practiced customs was the bedding ceremony, in which the bride and groom were escorted to their marital bed by witnesses. Virginity, like so many things in medieval gender roles, was a burden unevenly carried. These stained sheets might even be displayed or kept as proof. especially in disputes over inheritance or legitimacy. Sometimes the couple was even undressed by attendants as jokes and blessings were shared aloud. But with a test, both public and painful, that often had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with control. The mood, awkwardly festive, the expectation that the union would be consummated then and there. He would abduct the woman, sometimes with the help of friends or kinsmen, and force a quick wedding, either through bribery of a priest or simply by claiming that they had already consummated the union. Sometimes the line between courtship and coercion was blurred beyond recognition. Few could afford a lengthy legal complaint. If they resisted or ran away, they risked disgrace, violence, or exile. Some were forced to remain with their captors for life, trapped in unwanted marriages where the fear never fully faded. In many cases, the law offered shockingly little protection for the woman. For noblewomen, abduction sometimes had political motives. The church, officially, disapproved of forced marriage. Canon law stated that marriage required the free consent of both parties, but enforcement was inconsistent. Priests were not always concerned with the circumstances leading to the union, especially if both parties showed up at the altar and the man paid his dues. And for peasant women, whose status was lower and protections weaker, the reality was even harsher. In rare cases, communities fought back. A father might gather his sons and cousins and ride after the kidnapper, sometimes starting feuds that lasted generations. Yet the practice persisted, lurking in the margins of law and culture, romanticized by some, dreaded by others. Over time, laws tightened. Church courts became more involved in verifying consent. Kings and queens issued proclamations against forced marriage. Today, we think of lover's choice as freedom, affection, and partnership. Picture a small candlelit chamber in a stone manor house, a bed draped in white linen. In medieval Europe, especially among the nobility, virginity was a commodity, one that could make or break a woman's future. For many brides, the pressure to prove their purity wasn't just emotional, it was ritualized, even performative. Afterward, the sheets would be examined for bloodstains, seen as confirmation that the bride had indeed been a virgin. Of course, not all women bled their first time. In some regions, more invasive tests were used. For noble families, the stakes were even higher. The consequences for failing a virginity test were sometimes devastating, and yet, many women learned how to navigate these expectations. Meanwhile, the pressure on men was negligible. A groom's chastity was rarely questioned. In fact, sexual experience was often encouraged for noblemen. Even today, echoes of these practices linger in certain cultures. Proof that ideas about purity, honor, and sexuality have deep historical roots. But back in the Middle Ages, for a woman, love and marriage began not with a kiss or a vow. Close your eyes and imagine a world where every flirtation is a sin waiting to be confessed, where longing glances must be suppressed, where a kiss, even stolen in a dark corridor, could send your soul hurtling toward damnation. In medieval Europe, the church was not just a moral compass, it was a governing body that regulated love as tightly as it did faith. Dating, as we know it today, didn't exist. By adolescence, young people were warned that desire was dangerous, that the devil often entered the heart through the eyes. Instead, courtship was bound in strict religious expectations, and any deviation was policed, not only by parents, but by priests, friars, and even the parish itself. From the moment a child was born, their marital future was already being shaped, often through religious instruction about virtue, obedience, and chastity. Secret weddings, especially those performed without witnesses or banns, were considered illicit, even if the couple had made sincere vows. Certain positions were banned as unnatural. Specific days of the week were off, and long lists of penitential rules were created to help guide couples toward holy union, but often resulted in confusion, guilt, and repression. The church needed to control not only love, but the public recognition of love. Courtly love stories, so popular in the High Middle Ages, celebrated longing from afar. They often featured knights pining for noble women they could never touch, a safe outlet for desire in a world where acting on it could be punished. Young men and women were expected to confess impure thoughts, and confessors might ask probing questions about attraction, fantasies, or physical contact. In towns and villages, it wasn't uncommon for the local clergy to keep mistresses or even secret families, all while preaching chastity to the masses. It was reckless, sometimes brave, sometimes foolish, but always dangerous. It meant refusing the marriage arranged for you, and instead seeking out a bond forged by affection, desire, or desperation. Dispensation could be granted, but it cost money. Once again, morality came with a fee. This turned even internal experiences into grounds for correction. The surveillance of the soul. If a nobleman's daughter ran away with a poor knight, or worse, a commoner, it could spark a feud or even a war. An unapproved union could be shunned, the couple denied housing or work. Sometimes they'd be dragged before a local court, fined, or forced to separate. Her family might lose wealth, her brothers might lose honor, and so, her love would be declared invalid, or worse, cursed. If they could survive long enough and produce children, they might eventually gain a priest's reluctant blessing, or receive retroactive approval from a forgiving lord. If a couple couldn't afford the fees for a sanctioned wedding, or lacked parental consent, running away was the only path to a life together, no matter how precarious. Their tales were sung not because they succeeded, but because they dared. In a world where love was not enough, they risked everything for it. But others never did. Living in the shadows, calling themselves married even when the law refused to recognize them. Two people might find each other and hold on. A man might lure a girl away from her family with false promises, only to abandon her. A woman might elope with a wealthy suitor to escape poverty, only to find herself cast off when his interest faded. The streets of medieval cities were full of such tragedies. Lovers turned beggars, wives turned outcasts, widows left nameless. It blessed union but scrutinized passion. It taught that the heart must be guided by God, not by its own wishes. A runaway groom might be declared a thief or kidnapper. Families sometimes sent armed men to retrieve daughters, especially if they believed coercion had occurred, or even if they simply disapproved of the match. But risking your place in heaven. Imagine two young lovers meeting in secret, at the edge of a village, beneath the branches of a moonlit yew tree. But church law required banns, a public announcement of marriage intentions, read 3 Sundays in a row before the ceremony. Skipping this step could make the marriage clandestine and legally disputed. Their hands tremble as they touch, not because of passion alone, but because they know that every stolen moment could destroy their lives. Clergy frequently preached that lust was a gateway to sin. These were often sold near churches or shrines, combining superstition with religious commerce, a quiet contradiction between doctrine and desire. Sermons warned against impure thoughts, dreams, or idle touching. Even holding hands with affection could be considered dangerously close to fornication if not properly supervised. Confession was one way the church enforced its control, but even married sex was expected to be moderate. The church taught that intercourse was for procreation only, and that pleasure was at best a distraction, at worst, a sin. Some theologians argued that even within wedlock, passion could invite spiritual danger. Marriage itself had to follow religious rules. A couple couldn't marry during Lent, Advent, or on certain holy days. Sex outside of marriage, of course, was condemned. This led to bizarre religious rulings about what was acceptable. Romantic literature and songs still flourished, of course, but often in a parallel universe where lovers were doomed, tragic, or tested by impossible odds. Clerics also discouraged interclass relationships or unions without proper consent. Though ironically, many priests and monks broke these very vows themselves. The church also forbade marriages within certain degrees of kinship, sometimes as distant as seventh cousins, which meant that in small communities, finding an acceptable partner could be frustratingly difficult. And then there were love charms, fertility prayers, and relics said to boost affection or help women find husbands. In all this, the medieval church acted as both matchmaker and marriage warden. It celebrated love in theory, but feared it in practice. So in medieval times, to love someone truly, freely, bodily, meant not just risking rejection. In medieval Europe, where love was tightly controlled by family, class, church, and law, to run away with someone to elope was not just romantic. Elopement, in its truest sense, meant choosing love over duty, over property, but in a society built on lineage and land, this was a grave rebellion. Among the nobility, marriage was a business transaction. Lands were exchanged, alliances made, enemies soft. Eloped couples often fled to distant parishes where they weren't known, seeking out a sympathetic priest to bless their union quickly and quietly. In towns, the situation was no better. Urban guilds, local councils, and even neighbors felt they had a stake in who married whom. And then, of course, there was the problem of survival. A runaway bride might leave behind her dowry, the only thing that could help her new husband build a life. Some couples tried to gain legitimacy after the fact. In some cases, especially among the poor, elopement was the only option. Ballads and folk songs preserve these stories. The lovers who escaped over moors, hid in forests, rode together on a single horse under starlight. Of course, not all elopements were romantic. Some were manipulative, even predatory. Still, the dream endured. The dream that love could conquer duty, that the heart might choose freely, that even in the darkness of superstition, class, and control, as you drift now, let that image soften. Two hands clasped in the dark, running through the trees, not toward certainty, but toward freedom, in a world where most people didn't choose their partners, and where romantic freedom was more fantasy than fact. A curious underground blossomed, a quiet economy of love, arranged in shadowy corners and whispered through back doors. Matchmakers, sometimes officially recognized, but often just village gossips with connections, worked quietly to bring people together. Their job was not to find soulmates. It was to find acceptable, timely match. A man with land but no lineage might be paired with a girl of decent blood and no dowry. A woman approaching unmarriageable age might be nudged toward a widower or older tradesman. The goal was survival, stability, and avoiding scandal. Dried rose petals wrapped in silk, supposed to make the bearer more attractive. Whisper your beloved's name into a knot, and untie it as they pass. Some methods were tender, some bizarre, others downright dangerous. Small carved figures tied together with red thread. A binding spell. And church, these little rituals offered the illusion, or perhaps the hope of control. A princess might consult a stargazer before agreeing to marry a foreign prince. A woman might be both midwife and healer, matchmaker, and suspected witch. Her fate depended on whether her efforts bore fruit or caused jealousy. If two people married and seemed happy, she was praised. If not, she might be blamed, or worse, accused of meddling with forces beyond her station. A king might carry a love token blessed by a priest or charlatan, indistinguishable, often, from one another. Some concoctions used mandrake henbane, or even belladonna, plants that could just as easily kill as enchant. Fornication, adultery. The line between passion and poison was thin, and the church, unsurprisingly, condemned it all as witchcraft. A witness, often a neighbor, eager to report what they saw. Sometimes it was just suspicion, and even that was enough to summon you. And lavender in a dim cottage, the hush of a whispered blessing behind a closed door. But more often, public penance. A man forced to walk through the town square in a coarse tunic, marked with ashes, carrying a candle as a symbol of repentance. The community watched, but without witnesses or the church's blessing. Such unions were precarious at best, whispered, but it was also, always, resilient. Judged, they might be made to kneel for hours, too fast, to wear a badge of shame for weeks. Still risked moments of affection, still dared to hope. And when two people strayed from the expectations of marriage, chastity, or propriety, they often found themselves summoned before the ecclesiastical court. The accused might be a young couple caught kissing behind the barn, or a widow seen in the company of a younger man too often, or a wife rumored to have met a peddler at the edge of the woods. Imagine the unseen hands guiding two lives toward one another, not with spells or power, but with hope, memory, and kindness. Others turned to the quiet kindness of midwives and widows who knew how to hide or end a pregnancy. These were the silent crises of love, buried beneath layers of fear and necessity. In the medieval world, love wasn't just personal, it was a public affair, and a public risk. The flicker of a candle in a drafty hall, a couple holding hands beneath the pews, hearts racing, a woman walking home with her eyes down, the weight of whispers following her, and yet still, a thread of defiance in the shape of a smile, a glance, a stolen moment. A servant girl, however, might lose her position, her home, and her reputation in a single rumor. And if she had a child, that child was labeled a bastard, with limited rights, no inheritance, and a mark that followed them through life. And when it went wrong, or broke the rules, it didn't fade quietly. It was judged, punished, and sometimes displayed for all to see. Pieces of wax marked with initials, bottles of perfumed oil, or talismans tucked into a lover's clothes. Not everyone believed in them, but many tried them. especially when all else had failed. But not all matchmaking was strictly practical. In some towns, folk healers and midwives doubled as love advisors, combining herbs, intuition, and long memories to gently steer unions into being. They brewed teas to calm nerves before a proposal. They carried messages between would-be lovers. Some even performed simple rituals to invite love, blending Christian prayer with older, earthier traditions. These women, trusted with births and deaths, often knew more about people's hearts than priests or barons ever could. And then, there was love magic. In markets and meadows, among the stalls of garlic and cloth, you might find a cellar of charms. Recipes passed quietly from grandmother to granddaughter. Bake bread with your tears to bind a man's affection. A few women were known to slip herbs into a man's food, hoping to make him more loving or more lustful. Still, people persisted, because, in the absence of agency, in the tight confines of caste, even noble courts had their share of sorcerers and astrologers. In smaller villages, the boundaries were even blurred. It was a dangerous business, helping people fall in love. And yet, it continued, generation after generation, an invisible network of women mostly, holding space for affection to bloom, even in the harshest climates. So as you settle deeper into sleep, imagine the quiet rustle of silk-wrapped herbs, the scent of rosemary, because the church wasn't just a spiritual guide. It was a courtroom, a registry, a moral enforcer. These were not grand halls filled with lawyers. More often, they were humble parish chambers, cold stone walls, a wooden bench, a weary priest-judge presiding. The offenses, sometimes there was proof. A pregnancy, out of wedlock, a child whose father refused to claim it. Punishments varied, a warning, perhaps, or a fine. Imagine it a woman, head bowed, bare feet on the cold church floor, standing silently as the priest announces her before the whole village. There was no privacy in scandal. Some couples claimed they had exchanged vows in private, what was known as hand-fasting, hoping it might retroactively legitimize their relationship. For women especially, the cost of stepping outside the lines was steep. A nobleman might survive a scandal with a fine or a quick marriage. Some women, in desperation, abandoned their babies, leaving them at church doors or convent gates. And yet, people still fell for one another, because even in a world of rules and consequences, love remained a stubborn human instinct, messy, unpredictable, and often stronger than fear. So as you rest now, picture a quiet church at dusk. Love in the Middle Ages may have been dangerous. In the modern world, we like to imagine love as priceless, as something that rises beyond the weight of money, status, or property. But in medieval times, love, or at least marriage, came with a price tag, and often, it was painfully literal. Welcome to the world of dowries and bride prices, where affection bowed to accounts, and courtship often began not with poetry, but with negotiations. For a woman to marry, her family usually needed to offer a dowry, a sum of money, land, livestock, tools, or even clothing and linens, handed over to the husband or his family. A poor man might marry a plainer woman for her sheep and land. A struggling farmer might seek a young wife whose father owned 2 plows and a cow. Romantic, no, but practical. Undoubtedly, it was not a gift of generosity. It was expected, required. Without a dowry, many women simply couldn't marry. In others, the bride remained with her new husband, her parents promising the sum eventually. Meanwhile, she lived as a bargained object, a constant reminder of promises not yet delivered. 2 people, strangers on their wedding day, might learn to share work, raise children, tend a garden, and eventually find some form of tenderness, burdened by duty and quietly aware that their own worth had once been measured in goats, silver, or sacks of wheat. But it was rarely fireworks or passion. It was endurance, compromise, a kind of companionship shaped by necessity, not dreamed, but arranged, like the dishes on the wedding table, simple, expected, and already cooling. Picture a weary father counting coins by candlelight, wondering how he will afford to marry off all 3 girls, and in a quiet corner of a drafty stone hall, a young bride, freshly smoothing the folds of her homespun gown and whispering to herself, "This is my life now." The dowry served as a form of protection, a buffer against poverty should the husband die, but it also acted like a business investment. A poor family with several daughters might bankrupt themselves to see just one girl well married. A noble daughter might be sold off at age 12 or 13, sent hundreds of miles from home to secure her family's political future. Her dowry might include entire villages, mills, or timber rights, along with her body, her obedience, and her heirs. The others, they might end up in a or worse, as lifelong spinsters. A status that carried a social stain. For men, especially those in the rising merchant or yeoman classes, a good dowry could elevate status or help pay off debt. And when sin had both social and spiritual consequences, falling in love with the wrong person wasn't just foolish. Among the nobility, the stakes were even higher. These weren't just marriages, they were alliances. And what if the dowry couldn't be paid? Debt, humiliation, lawsuits, families at war. In some cases, a betrothal was broken. Of course, not all marriages were loveless. Sometimes, affection grew slowly, like lichen on stone, and the shame didn't fall on just her. Her family, her village, even the priest might be dragged into scandal. And behind the walls of those modest homes and crumbling castles, many women learned to walk a delicate line, grateful for stability. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine a village elder tallying a daughter's dowry in a cold ledger. Not chosen. Some stories never made it into the chronicles. Not the ones about kings and conquests, but the ones that unfolded in shadows, behind cloister walls, beneath stable roofs, along the winding trails, through the forest where no one watched. These were the stories of forbidden love in the medieval world. Stories whispered, never sung. In a time when marriage was arranged, when desire was dangerous, it could be fatal. A peasant boy falling for the miller's daughter might find himself chased off the land. And undiscovering feelings for another woman might face eternal shame, or worse, trial by ecclesiastical court. A married noblewoman caught exchanging letters with a young knight might be cast aside, imprisoned, or publicly humiliated. And yet, it happened. People loved, even when they shouldn't, even when they had everything to lose. Sometimes, secret meetings bloomed at the edges of fields, a glance shared during mass, a hand brushing and others at the market. Sometimes, lovers met at night, under cloaks of darkness, guided only by moonlight and the desperate beating of their hearts. A love letter, written in charcoal on cloth. A stolen kiss behind the woodshed. A lock of hair, hidden in a pouch. But every secret burned like a candle. It gave warmth, and always risked discovery. If a woman became pregnant, there were no hiding it. In towns and manors, adultery wasn't always met with death, but it was certainly met with punishment. Whipping, fines, shaved heads, public penance. And yet, the stories endured. Ballads were sung of star-crossed lovers, of maidens who fled with stable boys, of lords who left their wealth behind for a widow with warm hands, of secret children, born out of wedlock, whose existence was erased in records but remembered in gossip. Even in monasteries where walls were meant to keep temptation out, there were occasional scandals, monks who slipped letters out under loaves of bread, priests who kept mistresses under false names, nuns who wept at night for the touch they could never again feel. These weren't always great love stories. Some were rooted in lust, others in loneliness, some in deep, aching affection that could never survive in daylight, but all shared something in common. A quiet defiance of a world that tried to cage the heart, and the human need across time, class, and creed, to be seen, to be loved, even if only in secret, even if only once. Tonight, as the firelight softens your thoughts, imagine two silhouettes parting at dawn, one slipping back into a convent, the other fading into a field of dew, neither turning back, both carrying the same secret, forever untold. As you settle deeper into the warmth of the night, let's drift now into the corridors of stone churches and echoing cloisters. Here, amid the flickering candles and heavy incense, love was not a wild emotion, but a carefully managed, often condemned force. In medieval Europe, the church didn't just preach about love, it regulated it, controlled it, defined who could feel it, when, and how. By the 12th century, marriage had become a sacrament, holy, binding, and no longer just a family arrangement. This meant that love and union were now subject to divine law. But divine law, of course, was interpreted by men. Clergy decided who could marry. They determined whether your union was valid, and they held the terrifying power to declare it sinful, illegitimate, or void. To people in love. That wasn't enough. You had to prove you weren't too closely related. You needed public witnesses. A priest's blessing. You couldn't marry during Lent. You couldn't marry someone already secretly wed. You certainly couldn't marry someone outside the faith. The church also taught that physical desire was dangerous. Even within marriage, too much lust between husband and wife was considered a sin. Sex, they said, was for procreation, not pleasure, and anything outside that narrow window was often met with confession, and sometimes punishment. Monks preached fiery sermons against fornication, adultery, and lustful thoughts. Women were warned to keep modest. Men were warned to control themselves. Love letters could be considered evidence of sin. A flirtatious glance, fuel for a future confession. There were confessional manuals, actual written guides used by priests, that listed every possible sexual act or impure behavior, and the proper penance. Some of them are so detailed, so dry, that they read like strange rule books for a joyless life. And if a couple fell in love, but the church denied their union, their options were bleak. They could elope, and risk excommunication, or obey, and live apart, possibly forever. And then there were the clergy themselves, bound by vows of chastity. Many priests and monks lived with deep internal struggle. Some broke their vows and lived with mistresses quietly, in separate homes. Some had children. Others suffered in silence, turning that longing inward, or into sermons meant to shame others. The church also regulated divorce, or rather, forbade it. Once married, there was no leaving. You could seek annulment, but only under strict and often political terms. Unhappy, abused, desperately in love with someone else. Too bad. The bond was considered eternal. In this life, and the next. Even weddings themselves were not the grand romantic events we imagine today. Often, they were brief, sober ceremonies outside the church doors. Only later did couples enter for mass. There were no elaborate cakes, no diamond rings, no passionate vows, just ritual, responsibility, and a lifetime ahead, with no exits. Yet, for all its restrictions, the church also introduced certain protections. It forbade forced marriage in theory. It promoted consent, even if unevenly enforced. And it recognized the spiritual significance of a bond between two souls, if only within their rules. Tonight, as the fire crackles softly beside you, picture a couple kneeling before a stone altar, their hands joined, their hearts uncertain, not knowing if what they feel is love, or something they'll be told is sin. By now, you may be sinking deeper into rest, your breath steady, your thoughts soft around the edges. Let's now wander quietly into the great halls of stone castles and parchment-filled chambers, where the flicker of torches lights up a different kind of courtship, one not of hearts, but of land, titles, and power. In medieval Europe, marriage was rarely about love, especially for the upper classes. It was about alliances, territory, securing peace between rival families, and producing heirs to preserve dynasties, because the union would combine estate or bring a dowry to a family. A young noblewoman, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, might find herself promised to a much older man, a stranger. She didn't need to like him. She didn't need to understand marriage. She just needed to obey. Her father might sign the marriage contract while she was still in the cradle. By the time she was old enough to marry, the deal had long been sealed. And for noble sons, it was no different. Their bride might come from a distant country, someone he had never met, but her family had ships, or silver mines, or claims to a disputed border. Marriage was war by other means. Every union, a treaty. Every child, a pawn on the chessboard of dynastic survival. Consider the Plantagenets, the Habsburgs, the families whose very existence depended on shrewd marital moves. When kingdoms were weak, kings didn't ride into battle. They sent out marriage proposals, even at the local level. Barons and lords married off daughters to secure loyalty from vassals. Your heart might say one thing, but your landholdings said another. Love, if it came at all, came after marriage, or not at all. And yet, there were risks. Some kings fell in love with unsuitable women, and chaos followed. Think of Edward IV, who secretly married a commoner, Elizabeth Woodville, or King John, whose disastrous marriage choices earned him bitter enemies. A bad marriage could spark a feud, or a war. or the collapse of an entire house. Dowries were fiercely negotiated. If a bride's family failed to pay, it could be considered a breach of contract. A wife could be sent back, or worse. Wives were expected to be fertile, obedient, and politically useful. Their job was to smooth tensions between families, to bear sons, and to keep their husbands' alliances intact. Imagine being such a woman, carried in a litter over miles of frozen roads, escorted by knights you didn't know, to a man whose language you barely spoke. Imagine standing beside him in a candlelit chapel, repeating vows you had rehearsed but never felt. Imagine lying beside him that night, knowing your future was no longer yours. Even among peasants, while love matches were more common, parents often pressured children to marry within the right social group, or to a neighbor with a good patch of land, a reliable flock, or a decent name. Romantic love, as we think of it today, was often seen as foolish, even dangerous. To love too deeply meant to lose control, and control, in the medieval world, was everything. Tonight, as the imaginary banners flutter quietly in your mind and the fire crackles behind closed eyelids, think of those who never had the luxury to choose, whose hearts bowed beneath the weight of land deeds and peace treaties, who stood at the altar not for love, but for strategy. Because, in the medieval world, love was optional, but marriage was obligatory. By now, you may feel wrapped in a hush. The hush of night, of candlelight, fading to memory. And yet, even in the stylist corners of the medieval world, the human heart stirred, quietly, recklessly, sometimes, dangerously, because while arranged marriages ruled the day, forbidden love ruled the night. Let's step softly into the shadows now. The alcoves of stone castles, the hedgerows behind chapels, the whispered exchanges in the back of taverns and kitchens. This is where love dared to bloom, away from the watching eyes of fathers, priests, and kings. For many nobles and peasants alike, passion had little to do with marriage. Desire, affection, longing, these crept into spaces outside the household. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, fierce, brilliant, married to a king. Yet the poetry of her time swirled with coded messages of courtly love. Knights wrote verses not for their wives, but for unattainable ladies who stirred their souls from afar. This courtly love became a literary ritual, a dance of flirtation, often a knight pledging eternal devotion to a lady above his station, a glance across the hall, more intimate than any touch. But not all liaisons remained innocent. In abbeys and cloisters, monks and nuns sometimes broke their vows. Scrolls tell stories of secret meetings by moonlight, of babies quietly spirited away, of clerics begging for forgiveness after falling in love. Among commoners, a maid and a stable boy might risk everything for a moment alone. But if caught, punishments were swift, a whipping, a public penance, sometimes forced marriages, or exile. And among nobles, adultery could be a matter of life and death. A queen caught in an affair, she risked more than shame. She risked execution. Yet forbidden desire persisted, because hearts are stubborn things. There were women who disguised themselves as men to be near the ones they loved. Men who wrote songs that could never be sung in daylight. And there were moments, rare and perilous, when two people defied the rules entirely. They ran away, left their estates, disappeared into forests or across borders, giving up everything for love that couldn't survive under scrutiny. Some became legends. Others were caught, tortured, made examples of. Still, the tales linger, the way love always does. In faltering letters, in torn ribbons found decades later in the hollow of an old tree, in names carved into church pews with shaky hands, these lovers lived in tension, between desire and danger, between passion and punishment. In a world obsessed with order and lineage, forbidden love was a quiet act of rebellion. And yet, sometimes, it was all the love people ever truly knew. So tonight, as you drift, picture them. Not in passion, but in stillness. Two hands brushing briefly as they pass in a corridor. A letter hidden in a sleeve. A final glance from across a crowded feast. Small moments, timeless moments, because even in the harsh world of medieval rules, the heart found ways to beat outside the law. As your breath slows, and the last embers of your day burn down to a quiet glow, let's wander gently now into the most powerful presence in medieval love. The church. In many ways, the medieval church acted as a divine referee in the messy game of human connection. Desire wasn't just a personal matter. It was a spiritual risk. Love could lead to sin, and sin led to hellfire. So even before a kiss was stolen, or a glance lingered too long, a young man or woman might carry a burden of guilt, simply for feeling. From the pulpit, priests condemned lust in its many forms: carnal urges, premarital affection, even a smile held too long. Marriage, the church insisted, must serve God's will. No romance, no passion, only duty, procreation, and fidelity. Marriage wasn't even considered fully valid unless it was blessed by a priest, preferably in public, preferably before witnesses. Yet paradoxically, the church also created rules that muddied the waters. You see, all that was technically required to be married was a spoken vow. I take the exchanged freely by both parties. No paperwork, just words, once spoken, considered binding before God. This opened the door to secret marriages. Two lovers who whispered vows under moonlight, and then found themselves bound by law and soul, even if they parted the next day. And once married, the rules didn't end. The church dictated when a couple could and could not engage in intimacy. Not on Sundays, not during Lent, not while fasting, traveling, menstruating, or nursing. Love had a schedule. Desire had a ledger. And if you sinned through fornication, adultery, or worse, there were penances to perform. Some involved fasting, isolation, or long pilgrimages. Others meant public confession, standing barefoot in the cold, wearing rough sackcloth as villagers looked on. But it wasn't just punishment the church offered. It also offered absolution. A confession whispered to a priest could bring relief. A marriage blessed at the altar could sanctify even a troubled union. And in monasteries, despite their vows of chastity, many monks and nuns wrote beautifully about divine love, using the language of romance to describe their longing for God. The very idea of unrequited, pure devotion, so central to the church, influenced how people thought about human love, too. And in rare cases, the church could even protect forbidden love. A runaway couple might seek sanctuary in a chapel. A compassionate priest might marry two lovers in secret, giving them legitimacy in the eyes of heaven, if not the village. So while the church seemed like an enforcer, it was also a mirror, reflecting the tension between earthly love and eternal salvation. It tried to tame desire, but desire found ways to persist, like wild vines through the stones of a cloister wall. So tonight, as you drift toward dreams, imagine this strange balance: a world where your first crush could be a mortal sin, where falling in love might damn your soul, or save it, where God listened, silently, as you whispered someone's name in the dark. Close your eyes now. The stars are high, the candle's almost out, and we're re-entering one of the most quietly strange corners of medieval life. The world of love, magic. Because when the heart aches, and custom, church, and class all say no, sometimes people turn to other means. In a time where science and superstition danced closely together, it wasn't so unusual to seek help from the local wise woman, or a cunning man said to know charms and cures for love. If your beloved looked the other way, you might be told to slip a certain herb into their drink: basil for fidelity, rosemary for remembrance, or thyme to stir desire. Some believed a love charm could be made from a drop of blood, a strand of hair, or even clothing worn close to the skin. These items were woven into little pouches and worn secretly. Close to the heart, it was risky, forbidden, and sometimes punishable. But to the lovesick, it felt worth the danger. For those who longed in silence, there were whispered spells: as the moon waxes, so may his love for me grow. As this knot tightens, may a heart draw near. These words were spoken over candles or wells, or scrawled in hidden letters. Superstitions also guided daily rituals. Want to know if your beloved truly loved you? Bake a cake with your sweat in it. If he ate it without complaint, he was yours. Or perhaps drop a peeled apple skin over your shoulder. It might curl into the first letter of your future lover's name. Dreams were signs. Winds carried meanings. The way a bird flew across your path, or the shape of melted wax in a bowl of water. All of it might carry the answer to your heart's deepest question. Even the church got a little magical at times. Some priests performed blessings for fertility or harmony, using relics or holy water to cure romantic problems. But not all love magic was innocent. There were darker arts, too: binding spells to keep a partner faithful, curses to break up rival couples, and tales of potions brewed with terrifying ingredients: powdered bones, graveyard earth, or worse. These were rare, of course, but the fear of them was very real. so much so that women were sometimes accused of witchcraft just for being too desirable or too persuasive. One rumor claimed that a woman's gaze could ensnare a man's soul. Another said that if a girl sang to the moon while combing her hair, she could cause a man to dream of her for 7 nights. It sounds strange now, but in a world where medicine was crude and courtship was cruel, it was comforting to believe that love could be influenced, if not controlled, even if it meant trusting in the moonlight, or a dried flower hidden under your pillow. So as your thoughts drift like smoke, imagine some lonely heart, centuries ago, standing in the woods, fingers trembling, whispering a wish into the wind, just human, trying to make sense of love in a time that offered so little space for it to grow. Settle into the quiet now. Let the embers of the fire slow your thoughts as we drift into a darker corner of medieval love. One where desire clashed with duty, and romance could make you a criminal. In the rigid world of medieval society, not all love was permitted. In fact, most of it wasn't. The church and the state tightly controlled relationships, not just to uphold morality, but to protect property, bloodlines, and power. Marrying the wrong person could jeopardize inheritance, alliances, and reputations. So when people dared to love against the rules, the punishments could be severe. Imagine a noblewoman who falls in love with a servant. To her family, this isn't just shameful, it's a scandal. She might be locked in a convent for life, her lover flogged or exiled. Or 2 peasants from feuding villages who meet at a market and secretly marry. They risk banishment, or worse, their family's wrath erupting in violence. Adultery, though common in reality, was publicly condemned. A married woman caught with another man could face the stocks, be shaven bald in humiliation, or paraded through town as an example. In some regions, branding or mutilation was allowed, a permanent mark of moral failure. For men, the consequences were sometimes lighter, unless their affair threatened noble bloodlines. Same-sex relationships, though they certainly existed, were treated with even harsher consequences. While love between friends was accepted and even celebrated in poetry, romantic or sexual ties between men or women were often seen as sinful or criminal. Punishments ranged from public penance to execution, depending on the time, place, and who was watching. But love found a way. Letters were smuggled through laundresses or messengers. Secret meeting places were arranged behind barns or chapels. And sometimes, incredibly, lovers fled together, leaving everything behind. There are records of couples who escaped across borders, lived in disguise, or forged documents to start a life elsewhere. But it wasn't just lovers who paid the price. Go-betweens, the friends or servants who delivered notes, provided shelter, or kept secrets, were also at risk. A maid caught hiding a pregnant girl might be whipped. A friend who helped plan a secret marriage could be fined or jailed. Even love songs and poems were dangerous. In some towns, minstrels were banned from singing about illicit romances, fearing that they would inspire rebellion against moral order. But of course, they sang anyway, because love, in all its forms, refused to stay hidden. And that's what makes these forbidden romances so poignant. They weren't just reckless, they were acts of resistance against a world that tried to dictate who was worthy of affection, who could love, and who could not. So, as you drift now deeper into rest, imagine 2 hands reaching across the boundaries of their world, quiet, trembling, and full of risk, but also full of something else. Now we've come to the end of our winding path through the cobbled streets, smoky cottages, echoing chapels, and cold stone keeps of medieval Europe. Let your breath slow. Let the fire's warmth hold you gently as we drift together into a final reflection. We began this journey asking why dating in medieval times was such a nightmare, and we've wandered through the harsh truths, the arranged marriages, the class barriers, the punishments, and the painful silences. Love in the Middle Ages was often transactional, controlled, and bound by duty. For many it was not about choice, it was about survival. A girl might marry a man she'd only seen once. A boy might be wed off before he even knew what love meant. Families bargained over dowries like livestock. The church dictated who could love whom, and affection, when it bloomed, did so in secret, in stolen glances and coded letters. And yet, even in a world of walls and rules, people still fell in love. They whispered by candlelight, they met under the stars. They carved initials into trees and shared scraps of poetry in the margins of prayer books. They found ways to make each other laugh, to feel seen, to hope. Because, at its quiet core, Love is resilient. Even in a time when plague swept through villages, when war stole husbands, sons, and lovers, when poverty meant that one loaf of bread had to last a week, even then, people searched for connection. Some love stories from that era were grand and tragic, like courtly romances and forbidden affairs. Others were simple: a baker and a widow walking home together after market, a boy helping a shepherd girl fix a broken cartwheel, a man who waited each night just to see the candlelight in a certain window. These aren't stories you'll always find in books. They weren't carved into stone or sung by men, but they mattered, because they were real. And maybe, as you rest now, eyes closed, mind quiet, you can feel something of that truth in yourself. That deep, human need to belong, to be held, to be known. So even if life in medieval times was brutal, awkward, or cruel, even if dating was more a matter of duty than desire, love still happened. It snuck in through the cracks. It endured, just as it does now. And with that final thought, let your mind go still. Let the weight of history settle like a blanket around you. You are safe. You are warm. You are not alone.